So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the introducer, the director of the School of Architecture at Mississippi State University, Michael Burke, who is the other, in addition to the University of Utah, the other sponsoring university for this conference. So, Michael. The mic's not on.
It's not on? Okay. Well, welcome. You stole some of my thunder. I was going to thank everybody. So on behalf of the School of Architecture at Mississippi State and the School of Architecture at the University of Utah, welcome. This has been a really, really remarkable 2 days. It's a nice way to end the day for today. Looking forward to the presentation in a moment. I was just telling Billie, all that's standing between this presentation is food, drink. Put a lot of pressure on Billie. So I would also like to express my thanks and gratitude to the organizing committee of this wonderful conference and bringing our speaker here this evening. So thanks to Jake Gines, Aaron Carher, and Jose Galarza. I hope I pronounced those names right. Very well done. Very well done. And this time I'm really truly honored to be able to make the keynote introduction of Bilie Faircloth. Billie's a partner at Kieran Timberlake, a prominent architecture office established in 1984, and a serious leader in practice-based architecture research and innovative buildings. Bilie joined the firm in 2008. I can probably say with certainty, you have an incredibly enviable position that most of the participants here are very jealous of. I know I am. Faircloth, Bilie received her Bachelor of Architecture from North Carolina State University and a Master of Architecture with distinction from Harvard. She's currently lectures at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design and at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Bilie is also the Velux Visiting Professor at the Center for Information Technology and Architecture at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. Prior to joining Kieran Timberlake, she was an assistant professor, which she talked about a few moments ago, at the University of Texas Austin School of Architecture, where she instructed research studies exploring applications for conventional and emerging material technologies, and also conducted seminars on emerging construction and fabrication technologies. In her professional and academic research, Bilie conspires to pursue an answer to the question, why do we build the way we do? She leads a transdisciplinary group of professionals leveraging research, design, problem-solving processes from fields as diverse as environmental management, chemical physics, material science, and architecture. She fosters collaboration between disciplines, trades, academics, and industries in order to define the relevant problem-solving boundary for the built environment. Bilie oversees the deep investigations that initiate and inform each project at Kieran Timberlake. During the design, she guides teams in questioning the design process through empirical experiments using prototypes, custom analysis tools that are also created by their research group. She participates in the development of technology to inform high-performance design, including wireless sensor networks, predictive temperature modeling tools, and Tally, which is an application for Revit that provides accurate life cycle data and reporting tools to designers. She's also leading the development of ideal choice homes, an affordable, quick-to-build housing solution for India. Her articles have been published by the Journal of Architectural Education, the Princeton Architectural Press, the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, and Acadia. Her book, Plastics Now, on architecture's relationship to continuously emerging material, was published this month by Routledge. She lectures internationally to academic and industry offices and groups like us, including the Australian Institute of Architects, University of Nottingham, University of Washington, Harvard, University of Texas, and as well TED Talks. So with that brief intro, please join me in welcoming Bilie Faircloth to the podium.
Okay. Can everyone in the room hear me with the mic? Yes, I got a lot of nods. Thank you for having me here. It's really my honor and privilege to be with colleagues who are working out and working on pedagogy for building technology. It is a topic that I have spent a lot of my academic career wrestling with myself, and it has been my privilege to listen in to some of your discussion about how to move our collective agenda forward, which I think is a collective agenda about the power of design. I wanted to prepare a talk for you that would take you inside our practices, literally the things that we do on a day-by-day basis. I have not prepared a talk that will take you in narrative fashion through one building and another building and another building. Instead, I want to give you glimpses and insights into the things we do, the actions we take on a day-by-day basis that might give you some sense about how we define building technology, but also how we embed it, incorporate it, such that it becomes seamless and invisible in the way that we pursue design. I also want to give you a sense of how we organize ourselves. We've come to understand that the way we relate to each other is one of the most important things that we can design. Literally, how we structure ourselves as an office is a design problem unto its own that we have to be conscious of on a daily basis. The first thing I want to do today is to take you into our office via this video that was just released maybe a couple of months ago and give you a sense of Kieran Timberlake's office and the way that we structured literally our environment so that we can do what we want to do.
In this sector of Northern Liberties, until you get over to the river, this is the only remnant of industrial heritage left. It's always been in the back of our minds. This was the ideal space to move into. The brewery was over on this site, the bottling plant on this site, another brewery up the street. Where the trucks backed in to get the bottles of beer to go back out to deliver. You know, it created a wonderful prototyping space for us. The main design space, you know, on the upper level, level 2, is the old bottling and beer bottling portion. But we get abundant natural light in here, so it makes an ideal office, but particularly an ideal architect's office. One of the unique things about this space is that the furniture is all on wheels. We're not locked into partitions and stationary desks where they have to pick up all their gear and move it independently. They can just unplug their phone and unplug their computer on their desktop and move all their gear to another place, and they can be working with another team in 15 to 20 minutes.
Yeah, you didn't bring it up.
Individuals work in a variety of different types of teams, and we also work in a lot of different spaces. And having a building like this lets us move upstairs. I can move down to the shop, I can be in a conference room, I can be at my desk drafting, and it creates different interactions that we can have as a team. So that's part of the whole idea of our, desk being wheels, which is maybe a different time scale. So as we move between projects, we move kind of literally around the office, but then obviously on a day-to-day basis, being able to go downstairs and have a conversation or work on a particular project in the shop, come back upstairs and do another activity. I think it tracks the variety of the type of work that we do in the space. And our old building wasn't as responsive or conducive to that. We have a lot of ability to modify this space with the shades that go up and down, with all of the movable partitions and the conference rooms, and we're always kind of shifting for whatever we need to do on that day. So it feels more like the space responds to us, this great shell, than like we just fit into the little cubicles or boxes or fixed rooms.
Okay, so now that you have a sense of our context, and I really wanted to give you a sense of our space, because that is a space that comes 32 years after the founding of the firm. Yeah, okay, hold on. I will get back to the slideshow. Okay, so that comes 32 years after the founding of the firm, and as I said, what I want to talk about is how we structure ourselves. So by seeing that space, what you might begin to notice is literally we are nearly all on one floor, although there are facilities below. And as I talk about how we relate to each other, I want you to imagine the kind of question asking the kind of projects that we do happening in what is really an incredibly dynamic milieu that allows us to see each other, but also form ad hoc teams when necessary. I think that's really important to our culture and the way that research, searching and searching again, actually thrives in our firm. There are three key moments in Kieran Timberlake that I want to first talk about, because I also think that these key moments will allow you to understand why we talk about our practice as one that is research-driven or one that legitimizes question asking. And these key moments have a lot to do with how we've organized ourselves, or those moments in time where we've aspired to a new kind of organization. So in 2003, James and Steve decided to make a very strategic reorganization of the firm around one word, and that word was research. They decided to literally legitimize searching and searching again. I said earlier that they could do that because intrinsic to their own philosophy of design was that searching and searching again was something that architects should be doing. That's how their brains were wired. And what transpired over several years were practices that developed into the legitimization of that mode. And that we could search and search again through in many different ways, in many different forms. But what you're seeing here is probably the most recent manifestation of this diagram that talks about how we organize ourselves. And now you see that research is not at the center, but research is an entity unto itself alongside the action of creating and designing architecture and communication, or talking about architecture and design, or establishing discourse. We see these as three actions that we take inside the firm, and we've organized ourselves around design, invention, and innovation. But really what you're seeing here as well is the fact that all of the seemingly mundane parts of the office, you know, the way that we pursue the workplace, organization of the workplace, the way that we organize ourselves into a staff, our finances, our public relations, marketing, technology, all of those things also equally have to be scrutinized and organized in order to support this larger mission. A larger mission that includes, again, design practices that champion the legitimization of question asking. So this was 2003, and this was affiliated with the publishing of Refabricating Architecture. So here what you're seeing is that even in the publishing of Refabricating Architecture, this book proposed many new things about how we should be creating architecture. But one thing it also did is it said, you know, we should be thinking very clearly about who we bring into the creation of architecture, that we should in fact begin thinking about not only architectural consultants and not only contractors, but we really do need to think about material scientists. We need to think about process engineers and product engineers. They had begun to affiliate with the creation of architecture through this book many other disciplines that were normally unallied with our discipline that needed to be brought to the table to robustly rethink the creation of architecture, to ensure that its quality did not continue to decline and that its productivity increased. In 2008, when I joined the firm specifically and explicitly to create a group. That would essentially integrate individuals trained far afield from architecture, individuals who could reflect their practices onto the design process. Why did we do this? Well, we hypothesized that our collective intelligence as designers who could employ design practices were not sufficient to see and comprehend the true nature of design problem solving, and that our design practices were not sufficiently tempered to work with the bodies of knowledge that overlapped architectural problem solving. So picking up where Refabricating Architecture left off, where they imagined that we might want to talk to process engineers and materials engineers. By this time in the firm's history, we were talking about individuals who were trained in ecology and chemistry and physics and anthropology and logistics and economics and materials engineering as well. So we were talking about conspiring to create a group that would have the agency to be designers. They would have the agency to be responsible and work alongside all of the projects that were happening in the office, as well as conspire to create their own projects. What the creation of this group ultimately did was it answered a series of questions for us that design has to happen at all scales. Now, I should go back to this image and tell you a little bit about what's happening here. You see that people are duplicated. And this was in 2012 when our group was, roughly 9 individuals, and we had finally realized a full complement of skill sets that we thought would be necessary in the sort of first manifestation of this group. But what we were attempting to do in this image was to make clear to ourselves the way in which we did work across a range of scales, the way in which multiple disciplines embodied multiple methods and skill sets and could, in fact, work across those scale ranges. And so we have Eric Isley on your, what is it, your, gosh, left? Okay, sorry, I'm slightly ambidextrous. So you have Eric Isley on your left, and you can see he's trained as a materials engineer. Stephanie, who was in the video, who talked wonderfully about Kieran Timberlake's offices, she's trained in multiple research methods. She's anthropology training, materials engineer, environmental management, and she has a degree in architecture. So we can all be envious of her hybrid brain, and she actually has an amazing range of scales that she works across, from small scale consideration about chemical flows through industry to very large concerns about rangeland management. So that's what this image was trying to do. We were trying to represent back to ourselves and represent to others the ways in which people were literally positioned to leverage their way of thinking across scales. Again, hypothesizing that designers for architecture come from many disciplines, and that design has to happen across scales. But we also knew that a real definition of design had to also take into account time, a real definition of time, that we have to be both trans-scalar, transdisciplinary, and trans-temporal. And with a group like that, with the multiple functionalities in that group or ways of thinking inside that group, we were able to, in 2012, begin to realize some of the benefits of working with each other, but also working alongside architectural projects. So that's the second thing that we did. So in 2003, we identified research, legitimized research as a mode, as something that was going to be engaged. In 2008, James and Steve said, let's take it up a notch further and really, really build out this group and embrace transdisciplinarity. And then finally, in 2012, we began a very deep discussion in our office about our practices and about what our practices should be. We set out to redesign our relationships to each other. So let me stop for a second. I'm guessing there are probably about 100 individuals in this room. And if I were to say that each of you at each table, let's say, I don't know, this table right here, you're the research group, yeah? And all of you are architects. How do you relate to them, right? We had to think that through. But not only that, there's some of you architects out there that are really, really, really good at understanding detailing, right? And so you form this kind of group of individuals who think very, very clearly about, across all of our projects, about how things are going to go together. You're going to do some quality assurance. So even though you're sitting at a table, I'm going to say you're the research group and all the tables are building projects in the office. I'm just going to say that for a second. Imagine trying to structure those relationships, but then also imagine that even though you're sitting at a table, if you look at your colleagues across the room, imagine being with them in another group as well that might talk very deeply on a weekly basis about the practices that we should be engaging. Or imagine organizing another group in this office to talk about our BIM practices, or perhaps talk about, I don't know, the appropriation of new assessment techniques from the field of urban ecology. In other words, what we began to understand is while we had project teams that were operating, we had an incredibly robust research group, that we also needed to cross-pollinate between those two groups at another level, not at the project level, because the project level was great, but really at another level where we started to talk deeply about how we manage knowledge and how we begin to aspire to new kinds of practices and push new kinds of practices forward, allowing our projects to become test beds for new kinds of design practices. And so we reorganized ourselves into what we call a series of knowledge communities. And I had someone from the office send me this shot today. It's very dark, but this is the meeting from today that took place about 4 or 5 hours ago. On every Friday, the office gets together, and you see Jacob Manns and Stephanie Carlisle, two individuals that happen to be from the research group, that are introducing a new topic for discussion into the office about landscape performance assessment. So here we see a room full of architects who are learning about new tools that assess the performance of the landscape. We're not landscape designers, but we have begun to understand how even at that scale, under an appreciation of how the landscape performs, it absolutely impacts what we can conspire to do with buildings. So we formed a kind of conscious, we became conscious about our relationships to each other and to knowledge. And we have a rather new platform that we're working on right now to have multiple groups operating at once. So I want to start this next section by allowing us to wrestle with 5 questions. 5 questions that I want to ask you, and I'm giving this to you. I'm trying to be, let's see, this is sort of like the confessional section of my talk, where these are questions that, frankly, I wrestled with when I had to take up this new position. And so as I asked you to imagine that you are Kieran Timberlake and you've got this group of people here at the front of the room that have training in all these other fields, and you have training in the design disciplines, and you're going to try to figure out how to legitimize question asking, how to build up research infrastructure. You're going to attempt to determine what's best in order to allow collective intelligence to thrive. You're going to wrestle with these 5 questions, and these are the ones that I wrestled with, that my colleagues wrestle with, that we discuss on a day-by-day basis, and I thought it would be interesting for you to think about them, because I do think there's some relevancy here with these questions and the discussion of pedagogy. So the first question I have for you is, what is your agency? You know, Ryan, you talked about this a little bit when you said, let's just go do it. Just go do research. You know, what is your agency when you go and talk to individuals? Well, I had to wrestle with that question in a big way. Now, this might be a bit awkward, but I do have here some text from my resignation letter from academia. And I thought it might be interesting for you and instructive, only because what it points out is it's a liminal moment in my trajectory where I was moving from one model into another model, and I said this: Dear Dean Steiner, with this letter I do officially document my resignation from the tenure track assistant professor position I held at the School of Architecture, the University of Texas at Austin, since August of 2002. My unplanned resignation, and it was absolutely unplanned, is occasioned by the offer of a private firm position with the title of research director. So that gives you some hint as to where I'm going to be heading with this. I had a new title of research director at Kieran Timberlake in Philadelphia. The creation of and support for such a position inside an architectural practice is progressive. There is evidence to suggest that these kinds of positions will increase in the immediate future. Is that true? I don't know. This was 2008. I was prognosticating. As consensus builds between the academy, industry, and practice over pressing questions regarding material resources, fabrication processes, industrial ecology, and cultural and environmental sustainability, design researchers will consistently have the knowledge and skills to address such transdisciplinary problems and potentials. The ACSA and the AIA are 2 and a handful of chief organizations through which architectural research may thrive, and through which a unilateral redefinition of the academy practice-industry relationship may be redefined. I'm certain of this trend and will optimistically operate as an academic and scholarly ambassador inside professional practice. In closing, I would like to extend gratitude to the faculty, staff, and students at the school. I look forward to continuing this discourse and establishing a working relationship with the UTSOA. So there's a couple of things that to note from this letter is first that, again, it marks a liminal moment in my trajectory. I was transitioning from one position and one perception of my agency to another perception of my agency. It also prognosticates potential agency for both an individual, myself, and a collective. But more importantly, I began to realize as I entered into a group full of people, a practice that was 50 plus, and now over 100, that I had an incredibly important question that I had asked myself because I knew that everyone there also had to ask themselves this question: what is my capacity to act in the world as a research director? At Kieran Timberlake, we have a lot of discussions about agency, and you can begin to intuit from what I've already described to you, this firm that organizes itself around research, this firm that allows individuals to proactively identify research, a firm that requires individuals to gather to discuss near future practices, that we have, we want everyone to take up the agency to both identify those practices but also to participate in the discussion. So we have a very, very robust discussion about agency at our office, and we're all required to ask of our positions, what is my capacity to act in the world as a what, right? So what is your agency? That's the question I would ask for you or have for you. And I also think as educators, we are in the position of shaping students' perceptions of their agency, and we're in the position of through our practices, shaping agency. The second question I have for you is, how do you define research? So I have to admit that I took up this position of research director, but I knew that I also was coming into a firm that had a long established discourse on research. And I was coming into this at a moment when the definition of research for me was incredibly unclear. And I don't know if anyone has a really good, solid definition of that word. If you're really comfortable, you know what it is. I have to confess to you that maybe I still don't know what it is. When I walked into the practice, I knew that until further notice, I would define research as searching and searching again. And as I have proceeded over the last 7 years, I've hesitated to use the word research. And that's precisely because there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding around the word. Uttering it in a conversation throws me momentarily into a posture of defeat. And I'm going to read to you a little bit from a brief essay that I wrote on the word. It sends me reeling over a neurological tripwire that has me bracing for intellectual fallout fueled by various sources of misunderstanding. I'd rather avoid the term altogether, instead opting for a long mental exercise with my companion that brings us in close proximity to the potential of searching and searching again, without ever having to ponder the unexpected change in our behavior when the word research shows up. My 10-fingered grasp on the verb research, or the adverb researching, is momentarily loosened when the noun research appears. Research is a thing that is funded, my companion might clarify. Yes, that's true. But searching and searching again is a purposeful mode that cuts across the state of funding or not funding, and for that matter, services, contracts, and rules of thumb I'd offer. Instead of engaging this course of thought, one that would have us articulate irreconcilable dialectical apogees on the pairing of research with architecture, one where the noun research is certain to be heralded as the profession's salvation or decried as its demise, I look for a backdoor to a mode which I believe to be intrinsically embedded in our brains. And this is that mode. The question mark. It thrives in the mode searching and searching again. Once in this mode, our epistemological preconditions are neutralized. And I define these as those unspoken terms we've accepted that allows us to know something without having to really know it. I currently count among the most egregious of these how we know materials, and I'm certain you guys do the same thing. How we know materials, energy, equity, all matter of mathematical formula, time, ecology, and structures of governance. The mode searching and searching again begins to absolve us of having once accepted a precondition, because the first principle of inhabiting it is to bring all things under the scrutiny of the question mark. If we are able to set aside that framework of these preconditions that we place on knowledge and establish the mode searching and searching again, a designer could purpose herself or himself to questioning across multiple variables. She or he might amass the stamina required to know what is there in front of them, to sleuth and track that circumstance, that phenomena, that relationship, that thing that is right there before ever building anything. It is in this mode that we are certain to become vulnerable to the consciousness of our true and daily power, which is the power to inscribe a boundary around what we choose to include or exclude, the information, data, knowledge, that consideration which we use to make a thing. And it's in this mode that the ages of all scales, many disciplines, and a real definition of time might have the best chance to thrive. I don't know if you've you've certainly, all of you, have a very robust discourse on that word and on the term research and on all the ways in which we need to conduct ourselves when it comes to research. But there's something about design research that I found that when I engaged this position and I engaged discourse over this position, I did find myself coming up against a lot of tension around that word. And I wonder about how to neutralize that tension and whether searching and searching again begins to help us do that. The next question I have for you, the third question, is how do you define infrastructure? And I've already given you a hint as to how we have wrestled with answering this question and continue to wrestle with answering this question. And I should back up and say that we all have a lively debate at Kieran Timberlake over the definition of research as well. But the infrastructure that we are talking about here is not really literally infrastructure, which means the kinds of things that we talk about in terms of roads and bridges, et cetera. But what we're attempting to do in answering this question is to begin to see that thing that lies below or underneath or beneath our actions. And the piece of infrastructure that has become so central to our practices are enormous notes of interrogation. Or, this is a quote from Room with a View by Ian Forrester, that wonderful moment in the book where Lucy finds an enormous note of interrogation on the backside of a mirror. And I began to understand that the question mark, bringing everything into alignment with the question mark, was this incredible piece of infrastructure. We can acknowledge that there are things called infrastructural periods that align more with certainty, heuristics, and management processes, but infrastructural question marks align more with uncertainty, new knowledge, and discovery processes. We might also acknowledge that our management of the design process legitimizes infrastructural periods and has very little room for infrastructural question marks, or rather treats such entities as externalities. However, as periods and question marks impart such differing degrees of design agency, shouldn't we consciously choose when and how to deploy such essential infrastructure? So I submit to you that rather than any other kind of research infrastructure, the question mark is probably one of the most important pieces of infrastructure, especially in a group that is transdisciplinary. The fourth question I have for you to consider, and we consider this often, and these last two questions get into and require us to think about the nature of design, is how many things can you hold in your head together at once? I pulled this question out of my memory. It's one that I've been thinking about and one that I've heard implicitly through many of the questions asked over the course of the last 2 days. How many things can you hold in your head together at once? This was a question that was asked of me by the late J. Thomas Reagan when he was dean at NCSU, 1990 through 1994. He challenged us all in our studio to really begin to think about design as a multivariate problem. And I've begun to understand that I've been obsessed with that question ever since. And I've begun to understand that I think all of us are obsessed with that question as we begin to talk about how difficult and complicated and complex and beautiful and wonderful design is. What we're really saying is that we wish we could hold more in our heads all together at once. That's really what we're attempting to say, because we acknowledge that there's this last question that we wrestle with, which is how we define our power. How do we define our power? So at UPenn, in my course, 6 Facts, 6 Scales, one of the first exercises is to acknowledge all of the variables that participate in a design problem. Now, often this starts out with a recapitulation of something that James Marston Fitch said about the interrelationship between materials, theories, and techniques in that wonderful chapter in American Building. And he talked about the interrelatedness of the three and the way if one thing changes here, another thing changes there, and they are interrelated, and there's a lot of really robust stuff that comes out of new developments in those 3 areas. But as I began to ask my students about all of the variables that participate in the design problem, the map begins to grow and grow and grow and grow. And what we know becomes less and less and less and less until we begin to realize that we have a management problem. But really, is it a management problem? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it is or not. But what I do know is this. I do know that something of what we talk about, especially in building technology and in in a building technology pedagogy is the degree to which our power lies in our ability to draw a boundary around what will participate and won't participate in the design problem. It also lies in the power that we have to dive deeply into any one of those variables and know it, and really sleuth it down, right? So that is our power. We have this power where we inscribe a boundary around certain variables. And I would say that the goal perhaps is not that if we were to know everything, then we would design the perfect building or the perfect landscape. That's not it. But it is a pursuit of mindfulness and consciousness about what we're doing. If we can know more, if we can understand more through bringing other people who are typically not thought of designers into the design process, people trained far afield from our discipline, if they can come alongside us, if we can include them and make a very integrated process, will we be able to get closer and closer to a degree of consciousness that really does allow architects to know many of these variables? I know you can't read them, and this is a fun exercise, and we probably could spend the rest of the time doing the same thing, and I'd love to see what you guys come up with. Okay, so those are the 5 questions that we wrestle with daily, and they're 5 questions I do think have some applicability to the way in which we frame building technology education. They certainly have had a sustained discourse in our office. So if you pair that kind of wrestling through those questions with what I told you are the milestones of the formation of Kieran Timberlake, what I want to read to you now are our attributes, or how we would describe ourselves as a thing, what we do, what is our capacity, what is our collective agency to act in the world. So we are designers who practice searching and searching again. Collectively, we challenge ourselves to maintain the position that architectural practice should produce rather than merely consume knowledge. We had to begin to realize that after we began to legitimize questioning. We began to realize that we were producing knowledge, and that really we were making a statement about the fact that we didn't want to necessarily consume knowledge just to consume it. We needed to be in the position to produce it. We challenge ourselves to produce original inputs for design problem solving. We do this to the extent that the buildings we create may be and are often talked about. Actually, more and more we don't even question ourselves on this. They're talked about as test beds. The buildings we create are talked about as test beds. And not only the buildings we create as finished products are talked about as test beds, but the entire design process has become a test bed, because we've realized, as you're going to see in a few minutes, that we need different tools, different processes, different workflows in order to answer the questions that we want to answer. And so the design process and the buildings that we're working on and the buildings after they're constructed are test beds, and they have the potential to yield significant feedback for our profession and for future design. That's what we've come to understand. The information we affiliate with architecture problem solving crosses many disciplinary boundaries, no surprise there. Both the design process and scientific process are engaged as architectural processes. We have individuals trained as scientists in our office. They have a completely other way of seeing design. And so we've begun to really embrace and try to become in tune to when we need to leverage certain methods from the sciences, when we need to champion the design process, which is about synthesis, but both of them are engaged and legitimize as architectural processes. We do design empirical experiments, both to generate input for current and future design problems. We also embrace applied research. So Rashida, I'm not sure where we lie on your scale, but I loved your diagram and empathize with your wrestling. We do produce knowledge. We employ a range of tools, and we often find ourselves a lot producing our own tools, inventing tools. I think that you guys can probably imagine that the tools that we all have to research with, interrogate with, design with, they all seem to not do exactly what we want them to do. And so we very quickly realized that we need to put processes in place that would allow us to create our own tools, and that's something that we do. We attempt not to differentiate our research activities to focus on certain parts or pieces of the architectural delivery model. So you guys can imagine, I can just spell out the standard architectural delivery model from programming to schematic design, design development, construction documentation, bidding negotiation, construction administration, right? I didn't forget one. Okay, so there may be a preconception, and you know, this is something that we never wrestled with, I should tell you, that that research or that questioning or that impulse to let the question mark loose inside our design process would only happen during the design process. I've already said that our buildings are test beds, and so you can imagine that actually every part of the process, every part of the project delivery model is fair game for our philosophy of design. And finally, our projects. So one of the other things that we did in through our 2012 discussions is that we just decided that there were not classifications of projects. Our projects are projects. And so what you can imagine is that a building like the New London Embassy is staffed in a very specific and robust way. The creation of a wireless sensor network is staffed in a very specific and robust way. We don't differentiate between the two. One doesn't support the other. If we're going to do it, if we're going to put our time to it and our minds to it, then we're going to legitimize all projects as projects. And so we do a lot of buildings. We've created software. We've created and are getting ready to commercially soft launch our wireless sensor network so that other people can start to use it besides us. We work on novel envelope concepts, and all of those are equally treated as projects. And yes, one of the most important pieces of infrastructure that everyone in our office understands, because everyone in our office is considered a researcher. It's not just the research group. This model has matured such that people who are in what's called the research group are so deeply embedded into the design process that we now can't separate the research group out of those 100 people, that in fact in all of our projects you will find people who are deemed research group members embedded for a certain amount of time in whatever project it is. But everyone knows that the question mark becomes such the important piece of infrastructure for facilitating communication between people who have a background in, say, environmental management or people who have a background in architectural design processes. And then in terms of the day-to-day question-asking impulse in Kieran Timberlake, I wanted to give you just some sense of what that might look like or could look like. So if you can imagine that all the dots represent individuals at Kieran Timberlake, and that as a person asks a question or is affiliated with a question, the dot's going to grow in size. I just put these up here because initially when I diagrammed this was sort of a week in the life of Kieran Timberlake. We literally do ask a lot of questions, and we try to bring into those questions the right methods and the right approach to answer them. But our questions range, and I just want to show you that range. So from what's going on up there to what is the building context. You know, I want to tell you that what's going on up there turned into a 3-year in-depth study that created new methods for surveying green roofs. That's literally the question that was asked by one of the researchers when he spied a roof that seemed to be incredibly robust, and he wanted to know what it was doing and how it was contributing to a roof in a way that was never thought of initially. So what's going on up there might seem like a really basic question, but it turned into an incredibly robust study. What's the building context indicates that we, you know, again, really simple question, but you're going to see some evidence of how that also turns into an incredibly long, robust 7-year study. Can we measure the actual thermal diffusivity of the existing building envelope? So now we're getting into some realms where we can imagine what those methods might be. What are the possible forms for a concrete wall panel that is at once lightweight, self-shading, and resilient to transport over 200 kilometers? A question like that is incredibly specific, but it is searching for a form that would meet very, very specific requirements for a very specific project. What are the environmental impacts associated with installation, use phase, and end of life for selected flooring materials? Here we're leveraging life cycle assessment. What impacts does the nearby wildlife habitat have on building envelope design? We literally were designing next to a wildlife refuge, and we wanted to understand if there was any way that the ecology that we were working within was extended or connected to that refuge. How does climate data measured on site compare to regional airport data? How can a thermal transfer model be integrated into a digital design workflow? What I like about just looking at this group of questions, even if they all indicate different lengths of time for answering them, but they also indicate that the lengths will go to apply different methods or ways of thinking. So with so many different backgrounds in our group, we are able to leverage many different skill sets and many ways of working. But ultimately, what those questions point out is that we have to ask this other question: how nimble are our practices? How nimble are our practices? Practices is defined as the actual application or use actual application or use of an idea, belief, or method, as opposed to theories about such application or use. One of the other conversations that's incredibly important to Kieran Timberlake is to think about our practices and to begin to examine and to make transparent why we do what we do and when we need to do something differently. I'm going to take you through just 5 slides that give you some sense of how how the green roof study that I just briefly mentioned began to allow us to see information differently. So this is Stephanie Carlisle, and she's standing on top of a green roof. And you'll remember that I said we hypothesized that our collective intelligence wasn't sufficient enough to see and comprehend the nature of design problem inputs, their origin or range. So the observation made here on this green roof of what's going on up there did lead to a very long study. And it started with this an initial sort of statement, context statement for the study was that the performance understanding of a green roof is driven by an engineering system of parts perspective. And as an ecologist, what she began to explain was that, and also I should say again, she's trained as an architect and an ecologist. She began to explain that our understanding of a green roof typically ends at the drainage layer, and that this rich layer on top of soil is really never understood. So she was willing to bring to the design of a green roof an ecological perspective, or to see a green roof through an ecological lens. And so she purposed herself, along with Max Piana, another individual trained in urban ecology and rangeland management, to see and comprehend the design of a green roof differently. They were going to see it not simply as a series of technical layers, but as an experiment in thinking over time. And they were going to deploy a new method of surveying the roof and really actually having created quadrants on the roof. They were going to go through and notate all of the vegetation on the roof. And they were doing this because they wondered how the vegetation that was there actually compared to the initial planting. And they wondered if there was any observations that could be made by thinking about how the roof had changed over time. Could any correlations be made to how the roof was actually performing? And what they found out, of course, was that from the 6 original species on the roof, through the wind dispersal and bird dispersal, that we were now up to over 100 species on the roof. But they were also able to make some other really amazing observations. They observed that one single factor wasn't at play on the roof, that they were able to begin to show how the form of the building actually began to participate in the creation of more dense areas of vegetative cover, a greater degree of species richness, and a greater degree of biodiversity. And so there was this exchange between not only the form of the overall massing of the building, but literally the form of the drainage plane itself. And they were able to describe to us the design problem differently than this diagram might, which is essentially a technical drawing. They were able to, after having surveyed 7 of our roofs, they were able to describe all the correlations between building form, soil orientation, and vegetation. and then ultimately began to think through what that might mean for the performance of the roof. So in this instance, what we were able to see is that the factors contributing to green roof composition, literally how we draw those lines of vegetation, are newly defined. The species didn't respect those lines. Buildings are legitimized as applied research test beds. This is a really good example. We went back to every client. Our clients were very much interested in the outcome of this study, and we were able to not only survey vegetation, but we also had to go into a whole documentation of the maintenance regimes on these roofs as well. So it became an ecological study and a bit of an anthropological study on operations and maintenance. And then we also proved to ourselves the potential for transscalar, transdisciplinary, and transtemporal design as we began to allow Stephanie and Max to have a very robust conversation with us through the lens of urban ecology. So while we do a lot of this, a lot of projects, a lot of whole buildings, and novel building envelope concepts, what I really want to take you through in the last section of this talk are current, future, and near future practices. And this is going to go really fast, and there are a lot of slides, a lot of them. But I'm going to go through them because I want you to see them, because I do think it might, based on the discussion at the conference, I think some of these practices might get you thinking about things that you're doing in the classroom and the way that you're approaching and defining building technology, and the way, frankly, the way that you're shaping perceptions of agency with students. Current, future, and near future practices. I've organized these into a series of categories. So design inputs, their origin and range is the first category. Design inputs, their origin, range, and collection. So again, these are snapshots of what we do on a day-by-day basis. I said that at the beginning. Day-by-day basis. I'm not going to show whole buildings. Day-by-day basis. So I'm going to try to be very disciplined in describing to you in very simple terms what we're doing. So in this sketch, and you or this image, you probably already understand that Stephanie and Max had to do is they had to develop the capacity to survey ecosystems. So here we have an architecture firm developing the capacity to survey ecosystems, both discrete and those across ranges. And we are doing this in a way to be able to ask better, what is the building context? We've also begun to develop practices for rapidly assessing sites, such as rapidly assessing sites across hydrology, in geology, and a whole other series of terms. But we also have gotten into the mode of collecting data from those sites. All of this, again, as a means by which to create and question where design inputs come from, what their origin is, and what their range is. We're rather preoccupied with the definition of climate. And so we've also bring into our group a scrutiny of weather data files. And we've begun to use custom algorithms to work on those weather data files to make what we call TMY plus files that will allow us to basically understand what we could expect in the future of a certain site. We also have simultaneously considered a more nuanced understanding to the site's microclimate. And I'm sure all of you have had this discussion in your classes, but I think it's important to recognize that this is something that's having a robust discussion in practice as well. We recognize that, for instance, the site that is in downtown Philadelphia that is incredibly impacted by overshadowing and urban heat island conditions is very different as a microclimate than a site at the airport, and that means that we have to become really, really good at scrutinizing the source of our data as well and sourcing something as close as possible. We've also developed practices to deploy sensors. So here what we're doing is we're deploying these very, very small sensors that's hidden under the rock there. But we're doing this to begin to answer a question about the microclimate at this site versus a site that's across essentially a valley, just right across a river where we have other sensors deployed, and we're essentially, it's a very short-term deployment, but we're trying to collect data in order to understand the relative difference between those two sites. This happens to be a temperature and relative humidity sensor. Our current practices have allowed us to, or let's just say our current aspirations with these kinds of sensor deployments and being able to describe the context of a site and the microclimate of the site have increased dramatically of late. And right now we're planning a very, very large scale deployment that's not only horizontally but vertically for a site in Midtown Manhattan, where we are deploying, again, a range of sensors, deploying weather stations precisely at certain locations of the site. And we're doing this so that we can, again, begin to understand what it means to create open space at 80 feet above ground level, what it means to inhabit a building even higher up, and what kind of conditions might we begin to expect. And so the vertical measurement becomes really important as a design input into what we imagine the form of the future building that's going to be going there might be. We're also similarly deploying and have already deployed sensors and a weather station at this site in Philadelphia. And here we're also using cameras that will be collecting video feed that will allow us to actually run that video feed through a company's algorithms, a company called Placemeter, who uses computer visioning to begin to understand crowd behavior and how many people are where and when and what. So essentially on this site, which is Love Park, what we've begun to do is try to define microclimate very robustly, not only through the temperature and relative humidity sensor placement and the weather stations, but also through the way that everyone there is behaving and inhabiting and when they're there and what they're doing, also to the degree that we're right now in the intensive period of a survey that's looking at what people are physically doing on the ground on site. But these are all practices that we've, again, developed in order to define what design problem inputs should be. What should they be? And how might the description of a site to such a degree allow us to know what to do there as designers. We've also deployed these kinds of sensors on building envelopes, existing building envelopes, and this has allowed us to do a range of things, such as characterize the thermal comfort, use a suite of sensors to characterize the thermal comfort of an existing room in order, again, to know how to renovate that space or how to deeply retrofit that space. But it's also allowed us to do things like this, and I continue to love this image of the laptop hooked up to the building. I don't know which one's bigger, but essentially it's allowed us to calculate things like the thermal diffusivity of this envelope and allow us to understand the relative difference between orientation. And again, it's an existing building where we are doing a deep retrofit, so we do have to begin to understand some of these things. Our practices of data collection have allowed us to make some really great observations about the contribution of vegetation to the thermal performance of an envelope. So we were able to see in our data set, for instance, for this building, the relative contribution of vegetation to the insulation on the building envelope in the leaves off and leaves on position. And even in this site that I just previously showed you, this is the proposed plan by Hargrave Associates for Love Park. But what you're seeing here is, you can just barely make it out, that you see that the round crown volume of the tree actually has a smaller sphere nested inside it. There's, I think in some of them there's 3 or 4 spheres. So with individuals who are trained in environmental management, we also can begin to look at change over time in this site. So the smaller volume, smaller sphere represents the new tree. The larger sphere represents the expected growth of that tree. And here we were basically testing, using the growth patterns of these trees, testing the contribution of tree growth to what we imagined the model thermal comfort of the site might be. But we were able to do that because we really had a very clear question we wanted to ask. We've also developed wireless sensors, and we've deployed them on a number of projects. We did this because what we needed a low-cost, high-density, real-time technology that we could deploy rapidly on a site. And we couldn't do that with the sensors that we were previously using. So we did develop a series of prototypes, and we worked at this again and again and again, and then began to deploy them in order to collect data, analyze data, interpret it, and then finally make some decisions and get some feedback. So the green roof studies also made use of this information, and they began to correlate the quadrants that they were surveying with soil moisture, and began to make observations about the species richness and vegetative cover relative to soil moisture. We deployed these sensors at a building, and we were able to, an existing building, we were able to, yes, calculate the thermal diffusivity of the building envelope. And then most recently, we've deployed about 300 of these sensors in our new facility in Northern Liberties. And right now what we're doing with these sensors is we are gaining feedback about essentially how to sail the ship, how to run the building. And we're doing that in conjunction with the systems that are in the building. So this is the sensor layout. But more than that, we're also delving into the practices of data visualization. And so we have surveys that are going out annually, or sorry, not annually, daily, hourly. Surveys that are going out hourly. And those surveys are represented back to us as a kind of heat map. And did you catch the funny quote? Yeah. And then also, what we're also doing is not only visualizing it as a heat map, but then we're also delving into this idea of web-based data visualization as a way of representing and connecting to the databases that we're creating. So as you can see, we're collecting data, we're creating databases of information. As inputs, they have to be connected robustly into the digital models that we're creating, and we have to be able to query that digital information. So in this instance, we're testing out a new way of not only visualizing that data spatially, planimetrically, but also in section as well, because that ultimately is the intention of the research that we're doing. We've assembled our wireless sensor network and put it in the hands of designers. Ryan Welch and myself have taught twice now a workshop called Materials as Probes. And that workshop was taught at the University of Minnesota and at Harvard GSD. But essentially here, what we were doing is taking advantage of this idea of real-time measurement and taking advantage of our penchant for making forms as designers, and wondering what would happen within a span of 5 days if we were to iterate over and over and over again based on the acquisition of real-time data and based on mandates of how forms must perform. How would we be able to measure the actual see and comprehend and adjust that form in a really intelligent way? And so we had a series of students using the data in a way to make and manipulate a series of volumes. And they were able to do this to such a degree that by the end of the experiment, on the last experiment, they get to define themselves, and they had to search for a form that meets a series of objectives. But in this instance, by the fourth experiment, they had to be 3 competing objectives. In other words, optimization wasn't the rule of the day. What we were attempting to do is to get them to create conflicts, thermal conflicts in their thermodynamic systems in order to see to what degree they actually knew the environment, knew the data, and could predict what would happen. And so they were able to predict curves and to create some really unexpected forms that had to perform according to those curves. What was really amazing to see from this is that the idea of pairing real-time information with design practices allowed us to understand that even the collection of data gave us a sense of the iterative record, as did the actual prototypes that were in the that were deployed on the exterior. So our practices have to become incredibly nimble because they do create feedback for design decision making. So I said we create a lot of tools Some of our tools are incredibly simple that take maybe 2 or 3 hours to make. In this instance, what we were attempting to do is, to create a tool, a generative tool, that literally would provide a way to make a decision. Here we had a series of mandates about a zoning envelope, and this is a very simple script that we could create really easily through Grasshopper that allowed us to generate a series of forms, but really test fit those forms to the zoning regulations. I think the other thing that we've learned is that there's a model of practice here that not only creates new tools, but then allows those tools to be dispersed across all of the individuals in our office, and they become tool adopters, but also tool makers themselves as they begin to ask new study questions, identify new study questions, and then in turn create new versions of those tools. So the topic of viewshed comes up again and again and again for various different reasons. And so right now, I think we're on our 4th or 5th iteration of a tool that will allow us to query viewshed. But you can imagine that that's used at some place in the early schematic design process. We've also created tools that will help us manage the relationship between zoning envelopes and the need to fill those zoning envelopes with a certain amount of program, but also then to automate all the potential layouts that fit the requirements of the number of or let's say the number of rooms in the program, but also the zoning requirements as well. This just really shows the degree to which we could implement a practice that would allow us to manage what was a lot of information about zoning and room requirements. But we've applied this idea of creating tools that allow us to, that permit design authoring, optioning, and permit feedback to very large at a large master planning scale as well. And this tool, for instance, which we call our campus planning query tool, we were looking at the planning of a campus, but also looking at the relevant placement of certain buildings in a landscape as it interacted with very serious constraints regarding water and energy and cost, parking and space and people. And so this was essentially a heads-up display that would give designers a way of thinking about what their designs might portend for a certain option. Our practices have also led us to create our own software and to create our own software that's commercially available. So in this instance with Cellophane House, a project in Midtown Manhattan, one of the things that we noticed or we posited was that we could recover a lot of this material and that we would in many ways be recovering it to a degree that we would save a certain amount of embodied energy. And since then, our discourse has shifted from embodied energy to really being able to understand embodied environmental impacts that's affiliated much more with a life cycle assessment methodology. So our practices have led us to, let's say, democratize some of these tools and to understand that some of the practices that we are taking up in our office, namely the integration of life cycle assessment into the design process, is one that many designers want to engage. So Tally is a tool that permits that, and I know that there's a number of academic institutions and universities that have been testing this tool that is integrated into the Revit workflow. We also are testing, taking up immersive environments and the use of immersive environments. And here what's interesting is it's not so much about visualization as it is about how we talk to each other about what we're design optioning. And so here you see Ifri looking at the design options for a building, and what she's doing is essentially working through a series of scripts with 2 other individuals that allow for this building to be replaced by another building as the design team is discussing, what the best option is for the site. So all of a sudden, this tool on immersive environment tools, which I know a lot of academic institutions are engaging, becomes one that we aspire to both facilitate better conversation, but also to create a new practice or a near future practice of visualizing analysis and analysis results in a much more meaningful way. We also engage prototyping. So Cellophane House is a very large prototype and a very large proof of concept of many, many things. But I just wanted to give you some sense that there is a whole other realm of feedback that's engaged not only through the modeling and simulation and creation of very robust digital models, but there's equally a practice that's engaged to create and test through prototyping. So here you see pieces and parts of the Cellophane House. For the New London Embassy, we created a novel test bed that allowed us to explore optical phenomena, recognizing that software isn't the best to do that. So we created this framework that allowed us to test various glass makeups against a model and to take photographs in a very, very specific way so that we could begin to understand the relationship between the glass, the interior, and the perception of the glazing. We also created a series of mock-ups of the exterior envelope, and then obviously along with our partners created even larger full-scale mock-ups of the exterior envelope. For Ideal Choice Homes, this has been a project that has been all about creating prototypes, mainly because of the amazing logistical constraints associated with building in the India context. One of the very first things that we had to tackle was simply the access of materials, and so there was a lot of deep research into what kind of materials we could access. We knew we were working with concrete, but our practices really require us to be nimble enough not to insist that we use one thing over the other, as you guys can imagine. But it required us to formulate concrete mixes in our shop and begin to have discussions with our partners in India about their own access to some of these materials. This project has a number of goals associated with it, which were read earlier, but one of them was to be incredibly lightweight and low cost, but also to be highly, to let's just say minimize the use of energy in the building. And so here we are prototyping the relationship between the form of the exterior panel and the capacity for it to mitigate solar insolation. But this project also has to be taken to the next step, and so we have a whole series of practices in place where we will build on-site prototypes and on-site mock-ups. In this instance, we were on site for several weeks watching and assessing how this prototype went in place, because we are promoting a novel construction assembly. So I think I could keep going on what our practices are, frankly. I think what you're seeing here is a lot of nimbleness. I think what we've begun to understand is that we are a process-conscious firm and that we have to have process awareness. And so for any project, we do ask a range of questions, and then we do go about, this is the wireless sensor network deployment for Tulane University. We do go about asking those questions to such a degree that allows us to characterize what a building is and what those design problem inputs should be. It allows us to ask targeted questions for buildings. In this case, we were able to calculate the mean radiant temperature of the space in order to match what we were measuring with some of the stories we were hearing about what it felt like to be in that space. It also means that we come up with workflows for design iteration and for asking targeted questions through tools like Tally about design optioning for things like structure and glazing and building envelope components. And it also means that we might bring to a project like Tulane, we might bring to it the use of a tool like an immersive environments tool. I think in closing, what I wanted to say is that this goal of all scales, many disciplines, and a real definition of time has allowed us to conspire to a degree of nimbleness with our practices. And that nimbleness has become an incredibly important attribute of our firm, that we can actually begin to have a robust discourse not only about our rituals and habits on a day-to-day basis, but we can step back and scrutinize them. We can critique them, but we also have the means to make new ones. and to normalize new ones. We have the means to create a robust discourse around what we call near future practices. We know that information for architecture originates at all scales. We know that problem solvers for architecture come from a myriad of disciplines. We know that architectural problems are solved over time. I think the most important thing that I could say that summarizes why we're doing what we're doing is that we've come to understand that the challenge for us is to undo our compulsion to abstract knowledge. We want to reorient ourselves to the process of creating architecture by reckoning with information, scale, and time as it's real. And that we want to inscribe that relevant problem-solving boundary around all those variables. What this implies when it comes to practices is that we now need to engage a new practice. And that's the practice of how we acquire knowledge. It's a practice unto its own that really has to be thoroughly understood by us. I think the outstanding question that I would want to bring to you is that I see a deep relationship between pedagogies and practices, and that pedagogy does shape a student's initial perception of their design agency. Pedagogy shapes practices. Pedagogy has the potential to transform practices. And I think if there's any discourse that we would want to continue, often we talk in sessions like this about the relationship between the academy and practice, but I think it's really about pedagogies and our rituals and habits and our near future and future rituals and habits. What are we instilling? What are we creating as the potential realm for architectural practice? And I thank you for sitting here past time. And I could keep going, but I'm going to stop. Do you have any questions for me? Do you have any questions for me? I hope that was clear. I admit to you that the screen up here is like the text is really, really small, and I couldn't see some things, and so I was having a hard time when I was speaking, seeing. So if it came, I may have not been as clear as I usually am. Yes.
Stand up so you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, thanks. I'm curious if, well, there's a two-part question. Have you already, or do you plan to break into a mode where you think your group may have sort of its own set of clients that come to you for a kind of research service as opposed to purely through the channel of architecture? And also, I'm also curious, how do you prioritize? Are your teams embedded into project teams? Are you the liaison? How do you orchestrate that?
So the first question about clients. So we do have relationships with clients. We have separate research projects that we engage. Those research projects are funded separately. So that happens, that can happen. Prioritization is a delicate balance. Yeah, so you're picking up on, if you organize this group of individuals into a team, a series of teams, and if this is our research group, and they have the agency to be incredibly proactive, but at the same time, all of you are going to embed yourselves into their tables, then it is required of us to schedule our work very clearly, to have very clear communication between each other, and to make sure that we really understand what the priorities are. So we've begun to understand the cycle of what we call proactive research, as it's phased with projects that are on a more clear schedule and a clear series of steps that are part of the building delivery process. So over time, it's become clearer to me how that can be less of a detriment to our culture and more of something to anticipate and look forward to, that we're coming up on a cycle of proactive research and we know when it can happen. So we try to track that. Yeah. Other questions for me? I think I can hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
but maybe not everyone else.
Maybe
Yeah,
everyone
not
else
everyone
can't.
else can hear. Okay.
I'm curious about how you disperse your knowledge through your findings, your knowledge, your base
Yeah, thanks for
throughout the
asking
world.
that.
Because do you publish your research,
Yeah.
and do you think do you feel ethically obligated to publish what might be proprietary?
We do publish our research. We seek peer review for our research. The Green Roof research, for instance, has gone through 2 papers now, 2 peer-reviewed papers, and actually a chapter's just been published in a book on green roof design. There are a number of other ways that we talk about our work publicly in forums such as this. Internally, there's another question about disbursement of findings. So we do have a database with every slide up there has connected to it research findings that are written up and that are part of a database so that anyone can go in and look at those research findings that are associated with a project. Often those research findings become talked about in forums such as this or papers that we're giving to certain societies. So communications as one of the 3 parts of our practice is incredibly important to us. And that's what we mean, that we're going to seek peer review, we're going to seek to create discourse, and we're going to seek to allow people to understand what we're up to. A lot of it's not proprietary in the end, because you see the results through the buildings in one sense. And if it was proprietary, then we would take the means by which to protect that information. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
At the risk of sounding simplistic, could you estimate the percentage of a building design, a Kieran Timberlake building design that is based on research, and assuming that it's not 100%, what is the rest based on?
Have we met?
We were at Acadia together a couple years ago.
Okay, you look familiar. Did you ask me that question then? No. Which percent is based on research?
Yeah, I mean, is the building like pure product research? I assume not.
Yes.
It is.
Well, it's a philosophy of design. It's hard for me to parse it. I mean, essentially, we're going into every building design with this philosophy. So what I didn't show you are our organizational charts that map out this process. They're incredibly hard to read. But essentially, every project begins from a point of view of impartiality with something called a research and environmental design report. So before there are any sketches or any considerations of what that building would be, we articulate anywhere from 20 to 150 questions that we want to answer across the realms of programming, site, climate, ecology, hydrology, geology, resources such as energy, water, materials, environmental regulations, and applicable codes. So we build up a really robust description of context for that project, and then from there begin to identify strategies for that project or identify a series of goals. So you could say that from the very, very beginning of the process, you have a research-driven orientation for that building. Usually from that process, we will identify deeper investigations that might take someone into a 2-month-long study or comparative analysis on one very, very specific piece or part of that building. But you also have to remember that the design process is at play as well. So really what we're attempting to do is robustly define those design problem inputs. And that, from the very beginning, is done through question asking. So it's hard for me to parse it out. Yeah.
We probably have time for about 2 more questions, so I'll go here and over there.
Okay, Bilie, I'll make this really easy on you. I want to ask you a question, just make a real quick observation. We were talking earlier about how infrequently we get to publish in the journal Architectural Education as technologists. You were published in there recently. Your talk today is a reminder of why. You speak in terms of allegory, metaphor, art. I don't think I ever thought about infrastructure in terms of punctuation before. It's provocative and evocative at the same time. I think it's just a great reminder, I think, to all of us, your talk today, about finding other ways to talk about what we do in ways that can not only just communicate, but really move each other.
Thanks, Randy. Thank you. Hey, Rashida.
Hi, Billie. Thank you for your talk. I just had a question. It was really interesting to see the way your practice has evolved.
Yep.
And I've heard James and Stephen talk about it, you know, a long time ago now, and to see the way that it's changed. And my question is, do you think, I mean, certainly from your presentation, we can see the value added of your philosophy of approaching a project. I'm curious if you now see that clients are willing to pay for that philosophy. Are there, you know, when you're going for a project, when they're hiring Kieran Timberlake,
they're hiring Kieran Timberlake because of our philosophy.
Right, but in terms of budget, and you know, in what way do you financially see that clients are buying into the process that you bring?
You know, I have the privilege of having entered the firm in 2008, and I know how incredibly hard it is to practice and to cobble together a practice, and I understand all the financial challenges with practice. It can be daunting. So I don't have the privilege of seeing how this design philosophy emerged over time, and I wasn't present for that first milestone when James and Steve said, we're going to stake a claim on research. But I know that they built up a practice over time and probably early on began to form that philosophy around even the small projects that they took on in order to figure out how to orient themselves to building projects as designers. When I entered the firm, our reputation was such that people understood that we were a research-driven firm. We needed to mature that model and have done so, and have demonstrated that over the last 7 years what that means. I've seen increasingly the clients that we work with understand that that's our philosophy, and they are coming to us because they have very specific challenges associated with their projects that they realize align with the way that we think and the way that we work. So we feel very, very fortunate to work with some amazing clients who are already predisposed to have that discussion with us. It may not have always been that way, and I know that it's not always that way, because there's a whole other part of your question about how to legitimize these kinds of practices and generally and pervasively across the profession. And I think that's something that you're all a part of as you teach students, and as you inspire them to design their own practices. How do we begin to allow them to introduce these practices as being legitimate and value-driven? Are there other questions for me?
We need to move.
I
know. Yes, I know. It's unfortunate.
Now I'm really standing between drinks and meals.
This is the big event we waited for all week, and we have to cut short.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.